It was just an ordinary Wednesday when I found myself standing on Tara's doorstep, a bottle of wine in hand, feeling way more nervous than I should have. Chase, her husband, had been away on a business trip for a couple of days, and I knew Tara was home alone. Chase and I had been best friends since college, and over the years, I'd become like family to both of them. So, why was I standing there, stomach in knots, waiting for her to answer the door? I could tell myself I was simply being a good friend, checking in on her, but I knew deep down that wasn't the full story. There was something else, something I hadn't let myself acknowledge until that very moment. And I knew it was dangerous. When Tara opened the door, her smile was warm, though I could see a flicker of surprise in her eyes. We had hung out plenty of times before, but always with Chase around. This felt different, just me and her. She invited me in with a casual, "Hey, come on in," but there was a subtle shift in the air that made it clear this wasn't just a normal visit. We settled on the couch, the bottle of wine uncorked between us. At first, the conversation flowed easily, talking about Chase, his trip, work, the usual stuff. But as the evening wore on, I could feel something changing. The wine helped loosen things up, and before I knew it, we were talking about things we never had before, personal things. She laughed more than I'd seen in a long time. Her eyes lit up in a way that made me realize just how much I liked being the one to make her smile. Tara wasn't just Chase's wife anymore. She was someone else, someone I hadn't noticed before, or maybe someone I hadn't allowed myself to see. And I think she felt it too. There was a shift between us, a tension building that neither of us was willing to acknowledge aloud. At one point, our hands brushed as I handed her a glass of wine, and that simple touch was enough to send my mind spinning. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that she was Chase's wife. She wasn't mine. But the more I tried to push it away, the stronger the pull became. It wasn't just the wine talking. There was something unspoken between us, something I had no right to feel, but it was there, undeniable and electric. I could see it in the way she looked at me, the way her laughter lingered just a little longer than usual, the way her eyes met mine and didn't look away as quickly as they should have. I kept telling myself it was harmless. After all, we were just talking, right? But when I stood up to leave, I felt it. That weight. The weight of what had almost happened. Something had shifted between us that night, and I wasn't sure I was ready to confront it. As I walked out of her house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed some invisible line. Nothing had happened, but I knew it could have, and that terrified me. The next morning, all I could think about was Tara, the way her eyes lingered on mine, the warmth of her laughter. It all replayed in my mind like a movie I couldn't turn off. I felt guilty, of course. Chase was my best friend, and Tara, well, she was off limits. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I tried to stay busy that day, but by the afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I sent her a message, something casual. Had a great time last night. Hope I didn't overstay my welcome. I didn't expect much, maybe just a polite reply. But when her response came, it was different. Not at all. It was nice to have company. I felt a strange mix of relief and something else, a feeling I wasn't ready to admit. That night, I found myself heading back to her house. I told myself it was just to keep her company again. Chase was still gone, and she probably needed a friend. That's all it was, right? Just me being a good friend. When I arrived, she welcomed me in with that same easy smile, but the tension from the night before was still there, lingering under the surface. We ate takeout at her kitchen table, making small talk, but it felt different this time. The air between us felt charged, like every word we said was dancing around something much bigger. I couldn't stop staring at her. Every laugh, every little gesture. It was like I was seeing her for the first time. She wasn't just Chase's wife anymore. She was Tara, this beautiful, complicated woman sitting across from me. And I was drawn to her in a way I had no right to be. At one point, I caught myself staring a little too long, and she must have noticed because she looked away, her cheeks flushing slightly. That's when I knew it wasn't just me. She felt it too, and that terrified me even more. As the night went on, the tension between us grew thicker, heavier. We were both pretending nothing had changed, but we both knew something had. Then, out of nowhere, she asked the question I wasn't ready for. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if we weren't tied to other people?" I froze. My mind screamed at me to shut this down before it went any further, but the truth slipped out before I could stop it. I've thought about it more than I should. I watched her eyes widen, her breath catching in her throat. I shouldn't have said that, but it was the truth. And now it was out in the open, hanging between us like a weight neither of us knew how to deal with. "I'm sorry," she stammered, clearly shaken. "I shouldn't have said that." "No," I said quickly, my voice soft. "Don't apologize. I've been feeling something too. But we can't do this. You and Chase, he's sacred." The words felt hollow even as I said them. I knew what I should say, what the right thing was, but I couldn't deny how hard it was to sit there, knowing how much I wanted to cross that line. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I love Chase." Hearing her say that should have been enough to snap me back to reality, to remind me that this was wrong. But instead, it made me want her more. I had no right to feel that way. And yet, here I was fighting the urge to pull her into my arms and kiss her, something I had been thinking about for days. We sat in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us. The pull between us was undeniable, the temptation to let something happen. But I knew that if we crossed that line, there would be no going back. "I should go," I said, standing up, my body tense from the effort of holding myself back. She nodded, her eyes filled with things she wasn't saying. "Yeah, you should," she replied softly. But neither of us moved. We were frozen in place, both standing on the edge of a cliff, too scared to take the leap. Finally, I forced myself to walk toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I glanced back at her one last time. "For what it's worth," I said quietly, "I care about you. But I won't be the one to ruin your marriage." With that, I left. A few days passed since that night at Tara's, but I couldn't shake her from my mind. Every thought of her was like a jolt to my chest, a constant reminder of what we had almost done. The tension between us had been so thick that I had to physically pull away before we crossed a line neither of us could take back. And yet, the memory of her, the scent of her, the warmth in her eyes, the way her lips had parted ever so slightly as we stared at each other, stayed with me, haunting me. I knew this couldn't continue. I had to push these feelings down, but how? Every day felt like a fight against myself. I thought maybe some distance would help, but when she called a few days later, all that effort went straight out the window. I had just finished a run, sweat still dripping down my face, when her name flashed on my phone screen. My heart kicked into overdrive. I knew I shouldn't answer. I knew it would only complicate things, but I couldn't stop myself. I swiped the screen, and there was her voice. Soft, hesitant. "Hey," she said, "I've been thinking about the other night, and I wanted to make sure we're okay. I don't want things to be weird between us." Her words were careful, but I could hear the tension behind them. She was feeling it too. That pull. The thing we both wanted to pretend didn't exist, but deep down we knew better. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my pulse was hammering in my chest. "We're okay. I don't want to make things harder for you. Or for Chase." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could feel her hesitation, the weight of what she was about to say. "It's not just you, 𝐦𝐤," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about it too. More than I should." Her voice dropped at the end, and it sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced, torn between the part of me that knew this was wrong and the part that was screaming to throw caution to the wind. "I shouldn't have come over again," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew I didn't mean them. "Maybe you shouldn't have," she replied softly, "but I wanted you to." That admission hung between us, heavy and dangerous. My throat tightened, my skin prickling with the memory of how close we had come to crossing that line. And now, here she was telling me she wanted it as much as I did. "Tara, this is dangerous," I said, my voice low. "I don't want to ruin what you have with Chase. He's my best friend." "I know," she whispered, "but I can't stop thinking about you." I closed my eyes, her words hitting me like a punch. My resolve started crumbling, piece by piece. I had no right to feel this way about her, but God, I did. "I can't stop thinking about you either," I admitted, my voice barely audible. It felt like a confession, something I'd been holding back for too long. There was a long pause before she said the words that sent my heart racing even faster. "Can you come over? I just need to talk. We need to figure this out before before it goes too far. Every instinct in me screamed no, to end this now, before it spiraled out of control. But then, I pictured her alone in that quiet house, thinking about me. I knew going over there was a terrible idea, but I couldn't stop myself. My fingers were already typing out a response before I even thought it through. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. When I pulled up to Tara's house, my stomach was in knots. The last thing I wanted was to complicate things, but I knew there was no turning back now. The moment she opened the door, I could see it in her eyes. It wasn't going to be just a conversation. The same flicker of tension from before was there, but now, it was mixed with something more. Something unspoken. Something that could no longer be ignored. She stepped aside to let me in, her body brushing lightly against mine as I passed. That small touch sent a spark through me, and I had to clench my fist to keep from reaching out and pulling her close. I couldn't. I wouldn't let myself, not yet. We sat on the couch, much like we had the last time, but this time, the air was thicker, charged with everything we hadn't said the first night. The proximity between us was too close, but neither of us moved to create space. We just sat there, the tension building with every second. "Kate," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "What are we doing?" I looked at her, and the vulnerability in her eyes nearly broke me. I wanted to give her an answer. I wanted to tell her I knew what we were doing and how to stop it, but I didn't. All I knew was that I wanted her more than I had ever wanted anything. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "I don't know what this is, but it feels like I'm falling." She reached out, her fingers grazing mine, and that simple touch sent a wave of heat through me. My breath hitched as I turned my hand over, letting her palm press against mine. It felt intimate in a way I hadn't expected, like this was the moment we'd both been teetering toward. "I don't want to hurt Chase," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "But I can't pretend I don't feel this." "Neither can I," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "But I don't know how to stop it." For a long moment, we just sat there, holding hands, both of us fighting a losing battle against the inevitable. Then, without thinking, I leaned in. It was slow, hesitant, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to feel her, to know if this was real or just a product of my imagination. Her breath caught as our lips brushed, a light touch, but it was enough to set everything inside me on fire. I pulled back just enough to search her eyes, trying to see if this was something we both wanted. She wanted it as much as I did. Her eyes were dark, filled with a mix of desire and fear, but she didn't pull away. She closed the gap between us, her lips pressing against mine, soft but insistent, and that was all it took. The kiss deepened, all the pent-up tension between us exploding into something neither of us could control. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between us. Her fingers tangled in my hair, and I could feel the heat of her body against mine. Her breath hitched every time I kissed her harder. It was intoxicating. Everything about her, the way her body molded to mine, the way her lips moved with mine, as if we had been waiting for this moment all along, was overwhelming. I had never wanted anyone as badly as I wanted her. But just as quickly as it had started, she pulled back, her breathing heavy, her eyes wide with panic. "We can't," she gasped, her hand pressing against my chest, trying to hold me at a distance. "We can't do this, Cade." My heart was still racing, my body burning from the intensity of the kiss, but I knew she was right. This was dangerous. If we didn't stop now, there would be no going back. "I know," I said, my voice thick with frustration. "But, God, Tara, I want you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her hand still resting on my chest. "I want you too," she whispered, "but I can't do this to Chase. I love him." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and the reality of what we were doing crashed down around me. I let out a shaky breath, pulling back, putting some much-needed distance between us. "I don't want to hurt him either," I said quietly. "Chase is my best friend. But this thing between us, it's real." She nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I know it is, but it can't happen." We sat there in silence, the weight of our forbidden feelings pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. I knew we had to stop, to walk away before we destroyed everything. But as I stood to leave, I couldn't help but glance back at her, the woman I couldn't have, and wonder what might have been if things were different. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "Me too." And with that I left. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a fog, constantly replaying that moment with Tara over and over in my head. The way her lips felt on mine, the heat of her body pressed against me. It was like a drug I couldn't shake. But no matter how much I wanted her, no matter how deeply I was drawn to her, I knew we couldn't go any further. What we had done was already too much. Chase had called me the next day, completely unaware of the mess his best friend and his wife had almost caused. He told me about his trip, laughed about something ridiculous a coworker had said, and I did my best to sound normal. Every time he talked about Tara, though, my stomach twisted with guilt. He had no idea how close I had come to betraying him, to breaking a trust that had been unshakable for years. I wanted to keep my distance from her, to give us both time to let things cool down, but it seemed like the more I tried to stay away, the more I thought about her. That kiss was burned into my mind. How soft her lips had been, how desperately we had clung to each other, as if giving it would save us from drowning in our forbidden feelings. Then, a couple of days later, my phone buzzed with a text from Tara. "Can we talk?" The pit in my stomach returned. I knew what we needed to do. We had to end this before it went any further. But I also knew that seeing her again was dangerous. There was a pull between us neither of us seemed strong enough to resist. Still, I couldn't leave it unresolved. I couldn't let her carry this burden alone. "Sure, I'll be over in a bit." When I arrived at her house that evening, it was like stepping back into the same dangerous territory we'd found ourselves in before. The air between us felt thick with tension, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us both. She opened the door, and just seeing her standing there, her expression a mixture of uncertainty and longing, sent my heart racing. We sat on the couch again, this time even closer than before. Our knees brushed, and neither of us spoke for a long time. It was like we were both afraid of what would happen if we said the wrong thing. Finally, she broke the silence. "I can't stop thinking about you," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I keep telling myself that I shouldn't, that I need to focus on Chase, but it's not that simple." Her honesty cut through me. I nodded, feeling the same weight pressing on my chest. "I know. I've been going over it in my head, too. This isn't what I wanted to happen, Tara, but I can't stop thinking about you either." She shifted closer, and my heart pounded in my chest as the heat from her body seeped into mine. It would be so easy to reach out, to pull her into my arms again, but I knew I shouldn't. We were already in too deep. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her eyes searching mine. "I love Chase. I do. But there's something about you, something that I can't ignore. And I don't know how to stop it." Her words hung in the air, and I could feel the conflict radiating off of her. I felt it too, the same battle between what we wanted and what we knew was right. And as much as I wanted to be the strong one, the one to pull away and say no, I couldn't. Without thinking, I reached out and took her hand. The feel of her skin against mine sent a jolt of electricity through me. She didn't pull away. In fact, she squeezed my hand, her breath hitching slightly as she did. The closeness between us was intoxicating, and I could feel the magnetic pull drawing us closer, inch by inch. My thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, and she leaned in, her lips dangerously close to mine. "We shouldn't," I whispered, but my voice was thick with desire. My body betrayed me. Every inch of me wanted to close the gap between us, to feel her mouth on mine again. "I know," she whispered back, her breath warm against my skin, "but I don't want to stop." And just like that, all my resolve crumbled. Before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to hers. This kiss was different from the last, hungrier, more desperate. It was as if we both knew this was the last time. We allowed ourselves to cross that line. We clung to each other with everything we had, her hands sliding up my arms, gripping me tightly as she kissed me back with equal urgency. I pulled her closer, my hands running down her back, feeling the curve of her waist, the warmth of her body pressed against mine. Every part of me was on fire, and I could feel the same heat in her as she pressed into me. Our lips moved together in a frantic rhythm, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. There was no chase, no guilt, no consequences, just the two of us, lost in a moment we had been fighting against for so long. But just as quickly as it had started, reality came crashing back. Tara pulled away, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Her eyes were wide, a mix of fear and desire, and she was shaking her head. "We can't," she gasped, her hands still resting on my chest, as if trying to keep some distance between us. "We can't do this, Cade. We can't." My own breathing was just as heavy, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. But I knew she was right. We had gone too far, and if we didn't stop now, we'd ruin everything. "I know," I said, my voice hoarse with frustration, and something dangerously close to regret. "I know, but God, Tara, I want you." Her voice broke as she looked at me, tears in her eyes. "But I love Chase," she whispered. "I can't do this to him. I can't destroy my marriage." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The weight of everything we had done, everything we had almost done, came crashing down around me. I let out a shaky breath, pulling back and putting some much-needed space between us. "I don't want to hurt him either," I said quietly. "But this thing between us, it's real." She nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I know it is, but it doesn't matter. We can't let it happen." We sat in silence for what felt like forever, both of us processing the weight of what we had just admitted. I knew she was right. We couldn't do this, but that didn't make it any easier. Finally, I stood up, running a hand through my hair. "I should go." She nodded, her eyes filled with a sadness that matched my own. "Yeah, you should." I turned to leave, but just before I reached the door, I looked back at her. She was sitting there on the couch, her shoulders slumped, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. And in that moment, I realized just how much I cared about her. But I also knew that what we wanted didn't matter. We had to stop this before we destroyed everything. "For what it's worth," I said, my voice soft, "I care about you. A lot. But I can't be the one to ruin your life." She gave me a sad smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I care about you too, Cade. More than I should." And with that, I left. Chase came back the next day, completely oblivious to the turmoil that had been brewing while he was away. When I saw him, the guilt hit me hard, but I buried it, pushed it down. I was determined to keep things normal. Tara and I didn't speak about what had happened. We both made the unspoken decision to let it fade into the background. It was safer that way. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, the memory of her stayed with me. That night, that kiss, it left a mark I knew would never fade, no matter how much time passed. Some things, once crossed, change you forever.